That night, they laughed at the plain white envelope I placed on the table, treating it like the cheapest item in Chicago's most luxurious dining room. My father watched his new wife turn dinner into a public execution, while my sister lectured me on success. I did not argue. I just waited. When I finally spoke my one line, the entire table realized they had mocked the very person holding the deed to their future. My name is Riley Jenkins. I stood at the threshold of the private dining room at the Zenith Club, suspended 65 floors above the freezing, wind-whipped streets of Chicago. Tonight was meant to be a monument to excess, a fortress of wealth constructed piece by Vanessa Cole Jenkins, my father's 42-year-old wife. She had orchestrated this private dinner to celebrate Douglas Jenkins turning 63. Yet, looking at the cascading walls of imported white orchids, the personalized gold leaf menus, and the private sommelier standing at attention in the corner, it was glaringly obvious that the celebration was entirely about her own ability to spend his money and project an image of untouchable prosperity. I am 35 years old. I stepped into the room wearing a sharply tailored, minimalist charcoal suit. My wrists and neck were entirely bare of jewelry. I wore no perfume. I carried only two items in my hands. One was a small, unassuming square box wrapped tightly in heavy brown craft paper. The other was a crisp, unmarked white envelope. The contrast between my quiet entrance and the room's suffocating, golden-hued luxury was immediate and jarring. Vanessa noticed me before anyone else even turned their heads. She paused her conversation, her crystal champagne flute hovering motionless in midair. Her gaze swept over me, starting from my practical leather loafers, traveling up the unbranded wool of my trousers, lingering on my plain blazer, and resting finally on my unstyled hair. It was a complete, ruthless visual audit. Her expression shifted into a barely concealed sneer, making it abundantly clear that I had just filed for bankruptcy in her personal court of public opinion. "Riley," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with the practiced, syrupy tone of a high society matron addressing the hired help. She did not bother to stand. "You actually made it, and in your work clothes, no less. How incredibly practical of you." Seated around the massive, polished mahogany table was the rest of the chosen inner circle. Brooke Jenkins Hale, my 29-year-old half-sister, was busy contorting her upper body to find the perfect overhead lighting for a photograph of her caviar appetizer. She styled herself as a philanthropic influencer, building a massive online brand on the premise of saving the world. One heavily filtered, incredibly expensive gala at a time. Beside her sat her husband, Grant Hale. He was 34 years old, a vice president at a mid-tier commercial bank, and possessed the kind of aggressive, sprawling posture that only came from a lifetime of inherited confidence and a very expensive personal tailor. My father, Douglas, finally looked away from whatever financial anecdote Grant had been reciting. He did not offer a smile of greeting. He did not stand to embrace his eldest daughter. He simply adjusted the stiff cuffs of his velvet dinner jacket, let out a slow, theatrical sigh, and shook his head. "Well, you are here," Douglas said, his voice carrying the familiar, heavy weight of perpetual disappointment that he always reserved specifically for me. "You know, Riley, you are the only person I know who is always late to life, never quite catching the right train. Are you—" I did not flinch. I did not offer a polite excuse about the gridlocked traffic on the Magnificent Mile or the relentless demands of my professional schedule. Arguing with Douglas Jenkins was a losing game, a futile exercise I had stopped playing over a decade ago. I simply walked around the perimeter of the table, my footsteps entirely silent against the thick, intricate patterns of the Persian rug. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and devoid of whatever emotion they were hoping to extract from me. I set the small brown box gently near his plate. Then, I placed the plain white envelope deliberately beside his crystal water goblet, against the chaotic backdrop of sterling silver cutlery, folded silk napkins, and the elaborate, sprawling floral centerpieces. The cheap, Matte paper of the envelope screamed its presence. It looked entirely out of place, exactly like a foreign object dropped into a meticulously curated, pristine environment. Vanessa's sharp eyes locked onto the envelope immediately. I could practically hear the gears of machinery in her head turning. She was a woman who communicated strictly through the language of price tags, exclusive memberships, and luxury brands. To her, an unmarked, plain envelope was either an intentional insult or a tragic display of pathetic poverty. Her initial spark of curiosity was instantly eclipsed by her deep, abiding contempt for anything that lacked a recognizable, expensive logo. "Oh, my word," Vanessa chimed in, leaning forward so the heavy diamond pendant swung and rested against her collarbone. She reached out and tapped the edge of the envelope with one long, perfectly manicured fingernail. "What exactly is this, Riley? Did they run out of actual greeting cards at the pharmacy on your walk over here?" Brooke let out a high, breathy giggle, her eyes still glued to the glowing screen of her phone as she applied a filter to her photo. Grant smirked, raising his heavy crystal glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip of his amber bourbon. Vanessa was absolutely not going to let the moment pass. She recognized a golden opportunity to establish her dominance over the room, and she seized it with both hands. She picked up the envelope, holding it by the very corner as if the paper itself might contaminate her delicate skin. She held it up high for the entire table to see, effectively transforming my private offering into the grand opening act of her evening's entertainment. "Douglas, darling, you simply must look at this." Vanessa projected her voice loudly so it bounced off the acoustically perfect, soundproofed walls of the private room. "Riley brought you something straight from the office supply closet. How incredibly resourceful of her. Perhaps it is a handmade coupon for one free hug, or maybe a flyer for a discount grocery store." The table erupted into a chorus of polite, mocking laughter. It was a terrible symphony of derision, orchestrated flawlessly by Vanessa. They looked at the plain envelope, then glanced back at my minimalist, unbranded suit, and drew the exact conclusions they were designed to draw. They saw a woman struggling to keep up with the world. They saw a woman who fundamentally did not belong in the rarefied air of a rooftop penthouse. They saw a woman bringing a worthless piece of trash to a high society banquet. I maintained my rigid posture. I did not reach out to snatch the envelope back from her manicured grip. I did not defend the gift or myself. I simply pulled out the heavy, velvet-upholstered oak chair designated for me at the end of the table and took my seat. I met Vanessa's mocking, triumphant gaze with absolute, chilling stillness. Let her enjoy the warm glow of the spotlight. Let her wield the white envelope like a weapon of humiliation. Let them all laugh. She had absolutely no idea that the flimsy piece of paper she was waving around was the only barrier standing between her carefully constructed life and utter, catastrophic financial ruin. I placed my cell phone flat on the polished wood of the table, the black screen facing down against the crisp white linen tablecloth. I rested my hands quietly in my lap, folding them together. The room continued to buzz with their sharp jokes and witty observations at my expense. Grant started making a loud, unsolicited comment about current national interest rates and how some people just never learn how to leverage debt to build actual wealth. Brooke was now recording a video, softly narrating the beautiful family dinner for her hundreds of thousands of followers, while strategically panning the camera to keep my entire end of the table completely out of the frame. I tuned out the pointless noise of their vanity. I sat perfectly still, breathing evenly, waiting for one specific, inevitable thing. A few minutes later, it finally happened. My phone vibrated against the solid wood beneath the thick linen tablecloth. It was a single, distinct, heavy pulse. One short vibration. It was not a text message from a friend, nor was it a meaningless social media alert. It was an automated, encrypted notification from a secured banking server located hundreds of miles away. It meant the legal transfer was officially complete. The grace period had evaporated. The final electronic signature had been verified and recorded by the system outside the walls of this restaurant. The massive, invisible steel trap I had built had just locked firmly into place. I did not touch the phone. I did not even look down at it. I simply let the silence of that single, solitary vibration wash over me while my family continued to laugh, completely and blissfully unaware that the stable ground beneath their feet had just shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. "Honestly, Riley," Vanessa began, her voice slicing through the low, rhythmic thrum of the ambient jazz playing softly from the hidden architectural speakers. She picked up the white envelope again, this time holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were coated in something toxic. "When I saw you walk in with this, I genuinely thought you were serving us with an unpaid utility bill, or perhaps a late notice from a landlord. It certainly does not look like a birthday gift for a man of your father's stature." With a flick of her wrist, Vanessa placed 2 fingers flat against the center of the envelope and shoved it forward. The cheap paper glided smoothly across the vast expanse of polished mahogany, stopping with a soft, pathetic slide exactly 1 inch from the base of my crystal water goblet. It was a clear, unmistakable gesture of rejection. She was physically returning a discarded item to its rightful, lower-class owner. Brooke let out another sharp, breathy laugh, adjusting her posture so the warm, overhead pendant lighting caught the sharp angles of her contoured cheekbones. "Oh my God, Vanessa, please stop. You are being absolutely brutal," Brooke said, though the wide, bright smile on her face betrayed her profound enjoyment of the spectacle. "But seriously, it is just so incredibly vintage Riley. It brings back so many memories. Remember when we were in high school, and Dad offered to buy her a brand new convertible for graduation, and she actually refused it. She insisted on driving that horrifying, rusted silver sedan from 1998, the one with the mismatched passenger door that sounded like a dying lawnmower every time she turned the ignition." Brooke paused, looking around the table, actively inviting Grant and Vanessa into the warmth of her shared mockery. While Dad was trying to teach us how to network at the country club and build our personal brands, Riley was spending her weekends digging through thrift store bins for oversized flannel shirts and lecturing us about the virtues of living a simple, unattached life. It is honestly fascinating how someone can be born into this family and remain so completely, hopelessly immune to ambition. Grant shifted his weight in his heavy leather chair, leaning forward to rest his forearms on the table. He adjusted the thick gold watch on his left wrist, a subtle flex of his own financial security. "You know, Brooke actually has a valid point," Grant said, adopting the low, serious, paternalistic timbre he undoubtedly used when denying small business loans to desperate clients at his commercial bank. "It is a tough economy out there right now, especially for people without a clear, upward professional trajectory. Riley, if things are getting too tight for you, you really do not have to hide it from your own family. Pride is a luxury you cannot afford right now. I actually have a significant amount of leverage over at the commercial branch. I could probably pull a few quiet strings and get you into a back-office processing role. Data entry, document sorting, that sort of thing. It is nothing glamorous, and you would not be client-facing, but it is steady. It pays around $42,000 a year, plus a basic dental plan. It would give you a little bit of stability. You would not have to worry about skipping meals." I did not glare at Grant. I did not point out the sheer, suffocating arrogance of a mid-level banking vice president attempting to offer a clerical job to a woman he knew absolutely nothing about. Instead, I turned my gaze slowly toward the head of the table. My father, Douglas Jenkins, sat perfectly upright. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his dark red wine, letting the liquid linger in his mouth before swallowing. He set the crystal glass down with a soft clink and delicately dabbed the corners of his mouth with his heavy linen napkin. He looked directly at me, his eyes devoid of any paternal warmth or protective instinct. "Grant is offering you a very generous lifeline. Riley," my father said, his voice flat and heavy with the familiar weight of lifelong disappointment. "You would do well to swallow your pride and accept it. You have always had a remarkable, singular talent for taking any situation, no matter how elegant, and dragging it down to a bargain bin level. You walk into a room and instantly make the atmosphere feel so remarkably provincial. It is exhausting to watch you constantly fight against your own potential. Vanessa practically beamed at my father's endorsement of the humiliation. She raised her hand, snapping her fingers sharply to summon the private sommelier who had been standing discreetly by the heavy oak doors. The young man hurried over, his head bowed respectfully. "We are going to need to see the reserve list," Vanessa instructed, not looking at the sommelier but keeping her eyes locked firmly on me. "The private cellar collection. Bring the leather-bound menu, please." When the sommelier presented the heavy, embossed book, Vanessa did not even bother to open it. She simply rested her hand lightly on the cover and tilted her head at me. "Tell me, Riley, do you have any earthly idea how much a single bottle from this specific menu costs? I am talking about the Grand Cru selections from 2009. Do you know how many hundreds of hours you would have to sit at a data entry desk? How many months of your entire meager salary it would take? Just to uncork one single bottle for this table." The entire room fell into a thick, expectant silence. Grant smirked into his glass. Brooke held her phone steady, recording my reaction for an audience of strangers. My father looked away, entirely disinterested in my defense. They were all waiting for me to break. They wanted tears. They wanted a defensive outburst. They wanted me to stammer about my budget or aggressively defend my lifestyle choices. They wanted confirmation that their wealth made them superior and my perceived poverty made me weak. I kept my hands folded quietly in my lap. I looked directly into Vanessa's heavily mascaraed eyes and maintained a perfectly neutral, polite expression. "I imagine it is a very significant amount of money, Vanessa," I replied quietly, my tone completely devoid of sarcasm or anger. "I am sure it is quite expensive." My calm, unbothered concession acted like gasoline on a fire, because I did not fight back. They instantly took my politeness as absolute surrender. They firmly believed they had backed me into a corner of financial shame, forcing me to admit my utter lack of standing in their world. Vanessa's smile widened into a sharp, victorious grin. She had won the psychological battle she had started the moment I walked through the door. "Perfect," Vanessa declared loudly, her voice echoing off the high, gilded ceiling of the private dining room. She clapped her hands together once, a sharp, decisive sound that signaled the end of the debate. "Then it is entirely settled. Since you are so incredibly keen on showing up tonight with empty hands and cheap, blank envelopes, I think it is high time you actually contributed something of value to this family. As the eldest daughter, you should show your father some proper, tangible respect on his birthday. Tonight, let Riley show her filial piety. Riley is going to pay the entire bill for this dinner." I sat perfectly still as the echo of Vanessa's demand settled into the heavy velvet acoustics of the room. In my family, silence has always been miscalculated as a primary symptom of surrender. They consistently confused my lack of verbal retaliation with a total lack of ammunition. It was a behavioral pattern we established decades ago. Long before Vanessa ever learned how to properly pronounce my father's last name or manipulate his bank accounts. Growing up, I was the glaring anomaly in a household that worshipped exclusively at the altar of appearances. I spent my late teens and early 20s working 3 separate, exhausting jobs just to cover my tuition at a standard state university. I lived my life by the strict, unforgiving margins of a yellow legal pad, meticulously tracking every single dollar I earned to ensure I paid off my student debt completely by the time I turned 28. To them, my relentless pragmatism was an absolute, unforgivable embarrassment, because I explicitly refused to lease a luxury vehicle I could not afford, or carry a designer handbag purchased on a high-interest credit card. I was permanently branded as the aesthetic failure of the Jenkins bloodline. They viewed my frugality as a tragic lack of ambition, completely blind to the reality that I was quietly pouring a solid concrete foundation while they were busy renting castles made of sand. Grant's patronizing offer of a $42,000 data entry position was almost comical in its vast inaccuracy. I am not a mid-level paper pusher praying for a basic dental plan. For the past 6 years, I have been the managing partner of restructuring and cash flow investigation at Gray Harbor Restructuring Group. My daily professional routine does not involve filing standard corporate tax forms or fetching iced coffees for senior executives. It involves dissecting the financial entrails of failing corporations, untangling highly complex webs of hidden offshore assets, and executing hostile takeovers of heavily distressed commercial debt. When multi-million-dollar conglomerates hemorrhage cash, I am the forensic surgeon the board of directors calls to aggressively stop the bleeding, or the corporate coroner they hire to sign the final, brutal death certificate. I never intended to turn my professional crosshairs on my own flesh and blood. The collision of my corporate mandate and their personal vanity was a purely statistical, highly unfortunate accident. 7 months ago, my firm was retained to conduct a routine due diligence review on a massive portfolio of high-risk commercial bridge loans for an overseas private equity buyer. I was personally scrolling through thousands of pages of digital ledgers late one evening when a specific glaring line item suddenly stopped the air in my lungs. There it was, buried deep under thick layers of deliberate corporate obfuscation, Douglas Jenkins, listed as the primary, unconditional personal guarantor on a highly toxic revolving credit facility. That single, terrifying thread led me straight into the dark, tangled labyrinth of Oraline House Holdings, Vanessa's supposedly booming, highly publicized luxury wedding empire. It did not take long for a forensic investigator of my caliber to see the rotting wooden frame beneath her glossy magazine covers. Oraline House was not a profitable, rapidly expanding business. It was a sophisticated, high-gloss shell game designed specifically to siphon money. I traced the digital wire transfers myself. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from the Oraline House primary operating account into dubious vendor companies that magically shared a registered agent with Vanessa's personal wealth manager. Vanessa was systematically utilizing corporate lines of credit to directly fund her personal, extravagant lifestyle. She was artificially inflating event revenues on paper, invoicing phantom floral arrangements and non-existent elite catering services, effectively embezzling borrowed funds. To maintain the illusion, she was securing new, incredibly expensive loans simply to pay the minimum interest on the old ones. It was a classic, desperate debt spiral. The designer clothes, the extravagant European vacations, the very dinner we were eating tonight, it was all financed by a ticking financial time bomb that carried my father's legal signature as the ultimate collateral. I had genuinely tried to stop the bleeding before it reached the main artery. 4 separate times over the past 90 days. I had requested quiet, private meetings with my father. I brought heavily redacted spreadsheets to his office. I tried to rationally explain the severe legal exposure of signing personal guarantees for a corporate entity he did not legally control or actively monitor. Every single time, he shut me down before I could even open my leather briefcase. He accused me of harboring a bitter, deep-seated jealousy toward his beautiful, successful new wife. He loudly declared that I was trying to sabotage the only woman who had brought true prestige back to our family name. He actively chose the comfortable, sparkling lie of her success over the hard, mathematical truth I laid on his desk. After the 4th brutal rejection, I stopped trying to save a drowning man who was actively fighting the lifeguard. I shifted my entire operational strategy from prevention to strict containment. I spent the last 3 weeks meticulously constructing a dual-layered contingency protocol, working long hours in my glass office after the rest of my team had gone home. The first layer of my plan was an aggressive legal firewall designed to brutally and immediately lock down the corporate accounts. It was a mechanism to sever Vanessa's access to the bleeding capital before the federal tax authorities noticed the glaring discrepancies in her revenue reporting. I needed to trap her in her own financial web before she could drag my father into federal prison. The second layer was a highly specific, legally binding extraction plan designed solely for him, which brought my attention back to the object resting near his crystal water glass. Vanessa firmly believed she was wielding a weapon of my public humiliation. She thought she was exposing my poverty to the room. She had absolutely no concept of the reality sitting mere inches from her manicured fingers. The document folded inside that cheap, unbranded stationery was not a blank greeting card or a desperate plea for a handout. It was a fully drafted, pre-approved debt restructuring agreement backed entirely by my own private equity fund. It was a bridge loan that I had personally underwritten, taking on an enormous amount of professional risk to execute. It was the only legal instrument on the face of the earth capable of preventing the commercial bank from executing an emergency foreclosure on our family's lake house, the only property my father actually owned outright before he met Vanessa, the place where my mother taught me how to swim by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I had come to dinner prepared to hand him a parachute, while they were all busy celebrating the free fall. Vanessa did not hesitate for a single second after issuing her financial decree. She snapped her fingers again, a sharp, echoing sound that violently cut through the soft background jazz and instantly summoned the head waiter. He practically materialized at her elbow, a heavy silver tray clutched tightly to his chest. Vanessa did not look at him. She kept her eyes locked on me, a feral, triumphant gleam dancing in her pupils. She instructed him to discard the standard menus immediately. Instead, she demanded the exclusive, off-menu chef's reserve tasting experience for the entire room. She specifically requested the imported white Alba truffles to be shaved directly over the first course, and an immediate presentation of the platinum-tier seafood tower, complete with beluga caviar. Then, she turned her attention back to the sommelier, who was still hovering near the heavy oak doors. She ordered 2 bottles of a highly allocated, deeply rare vintage Bordeaux from the private cellar. I knew the exact market value of those specific bottles, because my firm often liquidated similar assets during high-net-worth bankruptcy proceedings. They were priced at several $1,000s each. She was intentionally constructing a check that would easily eclipse a standard down payment on a modest suburban home, purposefully driving the final total into the realm of absolute absurdity just to watch me break under the financial weight. Once the flurry of extravagant orders was complete, Vanessa tapped her heavy silver spoon against the rim of her crystal water glass. The sharp, clear ringing demanded the absolute attention of the entire table. She stood up, smoothing the front of her designer silk dress, practically vibrating with self-importance. She announced that tonight was no longer simply a celebration of my father turning 63. It was officially a dual-purpose event. She declared with a radiant, entirely fabricated smile that Oraline House Holdings was officially finalizing contracts to expand its luxury event operations across 3 neighboring states by the end of the 4th quarter. It was a massive, aggressive expansion, she claimed, a testament to her unparalleled business acumen and my father's brilliant strategic guidance. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I sat there listening to her throw a lavish victory parade on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. Brooke immediately seized the opportunity to capitalize on the manufactured narrative. She lifted her smartphone high, adjusting the portable ring light attached to the back of the device. She framed the shot perfectly, capturing the cascading white orchids and Vanessa's triumphant posture, deliberately keeping my face completely out of the frame while making sure the charcoal shoulder of my suit was just barely visible on the edge. Brooke spoke into the microphone using her signature, breathy influencer voice. She told her hundreds of thousands of followers how incredibly blessed she felt to be surrounded by such a driven, successful family. Then, with a sickly sweet, entirely venomous tone, she added a pointed comment. She told her digital audience that her elusive, independent older sister had finally decided to step up and generously host the entire extravagant evening. Brooke giggled softly into the camera, noting how beautiful it was when estranged family members finally learned how to properly contribute to the collective financial success of the group. Grant leaned back in his heavy leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. He adopted the condescending, measured cadence of a senior partner lecturing a junior associate. He looked at me with an expression of profound, manufactured pity. Grant stated that wealth was not merely about numbers in a checking account, but about the social and moral obligations that came with belonging to a legacy family. He launched into a completely unprompted, deeply patronizing lecture about family responsibility. He insisted that I owed my father a massive, accumulated moral debt spanning several decades. My father, according to Grant, had provided the prestigious surname and the foundational pedigree that allowed me to even exist in a civilized society. Paying this absurdly inflated restaurant bill, Grant argued, was not a mere financial transaction. It was a mandatory down payment on the respect and gratitude I had severely lacked for my entire adult life. The atmosphere in the private dining room shifted violently. It moved from passive-aggressive mockery to a direct, suffocating public shakedown. The invisible pressure in the room became incredibly dense, wrapping around my throat like a vice. My father set his jaw, his expression hardening into a mask of absolute authority. He looked at me, not with the warmth of a parent, but with the cold, demanding expectation of a ruthless creditor collecting a long overdue debt. He stated, in a voice that left zero room for negotiation, that if I possessed even a single ounce of genuine respect for him, I would hand over my premium credit card to the waiter without uttering a single word of complaint. He framed it as a final, definitive test of my loyalty. I was to pay the massive bill, inclusive of the mandatory 20% gratuity and exorbitant taxes, or permanently confirm my status as a disrespectful, ungrateful failure in front of his new family. I did not break eye contact. I did not shift nervously in my seat. I let his harsh words hang in the heavy air for 5 full seconds, letting the oppressive silence amplify the weight of my impending response. Then, I spoke. My voice was entirely flat, stripped of all emotion, carrying the precise, unyielding tone I used when dismantling hostile corporate boards during high-stakes negotiations. I will not be paying for this celebration, I stated clearly. When the final bill arrives, I will politely request a separate check from the server. I will pay exactly for the single glass of sparkling water I have consumed, and the standard chicken entree I intend to order. I will not finance a single drop of the rare vintage wine, nor will I subsidize a single ounce of the imported caviar. I am paying for my specific portion, and absolutely nothing else. Vanessa threw her head back and let out a sharp, theatrical bark of laughter. It was a loud, ugly sound that violently disrupted the refined, acoustic perfection of the room. She pointed a manicured finger directly across the table at me, looking around at Brooke, Grant, and my father to ensure everyone was witnessing her ultimate victory. She declared loudly that I had just spectacularly proved her entire point by refusing to cover the cost, she claimed. I had publicly self-confirmed my own pathetic financial reality. I had exposed myself as hopelessly poor and embarrassingly stingy. She reveled in my perceived defeat, loudly proclaiming to the room that it was a profound tragedy. I lacked both the basic capital and the basic class required to properly honor my own flesh and blood. While Vanessa continued her loud, triumphant monologue, a subtle but critical shift occurred in the periphery of my vision. Through the thick glass panels of the private dining room doors, I observed the general manager of the restaurant. He was standing near the main host stand in the corridor, holding a sleek black telephone receiver tightly against his ear. His posture, previously relaxed and deferentially professional, suddenly went completely rigid. He was speaking frantically with someone on the other end of the line, his free hand gripping the sharp edge of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned white. I knew exactly who was on that call. It was the restaurant's corporate event deposit department. The manager slowly lowered the phone, his face draining of all color. He turned his head and stared directly through the glass doors, looking straight past the elaborate floral centerpieces, past my father's scowl, and past Vanessa's victorious, mocking smile. He locked his wide, terrified eyes entirely on me. His expression had completely transformed from polite, detached hospitality to sheer, absolute panic. The gears of the machine I had built in the dark were finally beginning to grind in the light. The heavy brass-studded oak doors of the private dining room parted with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Julian, the general manager of the restaurant, stepped into the space. Throughout the earlier portions of the evening, he had glided through the perimeter of our gathering with the invisible, frictionless grace required of high-end hospitality. He was a man paid to ensure champagne flutes never dropped below the halfway mark and to anticipate demands before they were spoken. Now, however, his physical demeanor had entirely shifted. His steps were rigid and measured. His shoulders were squared with a tight, unnatural tension that aggressively clashed with the cascading white orchids and the soft, ambient jazz filtering from the hidden speakers. He approached the head of our massive mahogany table, deliberately bypassing the private sommelier and the two servers waiting quietly in the corner. His eyes darted nervously, tracking the crisp white linen of the tablecloth, actively avoiding direct eye contact with anyone, especially me. Vanessa was right in the middle of a sentence, still visibly vibrating with the warm, artificial high of her self-proclaimed victory over my financial status. When she noticed Julian hovering near her elbow, she froze. Her crystal champagne flute stopped mid-air. A sharp, deep line of profound irritation formed immediately between her meticulously groomed eyebrows. She absolutely despised being interrupted, particularly when she felt she was flawlessly executing a public humiliation. She let out a short, highly exaggerated sigh, leaning back into her velvet chair. "Julian," Vanessa said, her voice dropping a full octave into a tone of chilling, wealthy impatience. "We are in the middle of a very private, very important family moment. Whatever minor kitchen crisis you are managing, I am absolutely certain it can wait until after the main courses have been cleared." Julian did not retreat. He shifted his weight nervously from his left foot to his right, tightly clasping his hands together over his tailored suit jacket. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his starched white collar. "I sincerely apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Jenkins," Julian murmured, keeping his voice carefully lowered in a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of discretion. "I would never interrupt your husband's birthday celebration under normal circumstances. It is regarding the grand corporate gala you have booked in our main ballroom for next Thursday evening. I simply need to confirm a critical administrative detail regarding the payment information currently on file." Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically, flashing a performative look of utter exhaustion toward my father, seeking his silent validation. "Good heavens! Julian, are you genuinely interrupting our dinner for paperwork? This is wildly inappropriate. Keep the billing exactly as it is structured in our master corporate contract. Run the remaining balance and the final security deposit through the primary business card for Oraline House Holdings. Do it exactly like we have done for the past 4 events we hosted here." Julian pulled in a sharp breath. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. "That is precisely the issue, Mrs. Jenkins," he explained, his voice trembling slightly under the crushing weight of delivering bad news to a volatile client. "Our corporate billing department just received an automated digital notice from our merchant processing bank. The primary Oraline House corporate deposit account has just been transferred into a lockbox review status. All existing authorizations have been immediately suspended. I am legally required to re-verify the authorized representative before we can proceed with any further event arrangements or finalize the catering orders." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and metallic. For my sister Brooke and my father, the terminology was nothing more than bureaucratic white noise. Brooke casually went back to adjusting the exposure settings on her phone screen, completely unbothered. My father simply frowned, mildly annoyed by the logistical delay in his lavish service. But I was not watching them. I was watching Vanessa. The blood drained from Vanessa's face in a rapid, terrifying wash, leaving behind a sickly, pale undercoat beneath her expensive cosmetic bronzer. Her jaw clamped shut so tightly I could visibly see the muscles knotting and twitching near her ears. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, revealing a sudden, blinding flash of pure, unadulterated panic before she forcefully wrestled her features back into a tight mask of aggressive indignation. She knew. She might not possess the intellect to understand the complex, granular mechanics of commercial mezzanine debt restructuring. But she absolutely knew what a lockbox review meant. In the realm of distressed corporate finance, a lockbox is not a simple banking error. It is a lethal legal maneuver. It meant that a senior secured creditor had just bypassed her entirely, seizing direct control of all her incoming corporate revenue. Every single payment from her clients would now bypass her accounts and go directly to the debt holders. Her elaborate financial shell game was over. She could no longer touch a single dollar of the cash flow she desperately needed to keep her fraudulent empire afloat. Before Vanessa could formulate a plausible lie to dismiss Julian, Grant aggressively inserted himself into the conversation. He leaned forward over the table, puffing out his chest beneath his expensive suit, incredibly eager to play the role of the dominant alpha male equipped with superior banking knowledge. "Listen to me very carefully, buddy," Grant sneered, pointing a thick, gold-ringed finger directly at Julian's chest. "I am a senior vice president of commercial lending. I know exactly how these merchant gateways operate behind the scenes. It is a standard Friday evening processing glitch in the automated clearinghouse. You are going to go back to your office, manually clear that error code, override the security hold, and let my mother-in-law enjoy her evening. If you do not, I am personally going to call your regional hospitality director first thing on Monday morning and explain in graphic detail how you harassed high-net-worth clients over a false flag in your archaic computer system." Julian did not flinch at the threat. He looked down at Grant with a mixture of quiet pity and deep professional exhaustion. "Sir, I assure you with absolute certainty, this is not a processing error or a system glitch. The suspension directive came through with a highly specific legal routing code attached from a restructuring firm. We physically cannot process any charges until a newly verified, legally appointed representative clears the lockbox protocol." Deep within the pocket of my blazer, my phone vibrated against my hip. It was a single, heavy pulse, identical in cadence to the first notification I had received earlier. I did not need to reach down or look at the glowing screen to read the encrypted text message waiting for me on the secure server. The invisible timer had just run out. The strict, legally mandated cure period dictated by the master loan agreement had officially expired. The brief window for Vanessa to miraculously produce the missing capital or secure alternative emergency financing had permanently slammed shut. The technical default was no longer a threat. It was now an absolute, irreversible legal reality. The trap was locked. I slowly drew my hands back from the edge of the table. I picked up the heavy, starched linen napkin resting on my lap, with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision. I folded the fabric in half, and then neatly into a perfect square. I placed the folded linen gently onto the polished mahogany, setting it down directly next to the plain white envelope. I shifted my weight, sitting up slightly straighter, pulling my shoulders back and planting my feet firmly against the thick wool carpet. It was a microscopic, almost invisible physical adjustment, but it fundamentally shifted the entire gravitational pull of my presence in the room. I was no longer the passive, silent observer absorbing their endless insults. The calm before the storm had officially passed. Vanessa desperately needed an immediate escape hatch from Julian's intense scrutiny. Instead of recognizing the catastrophic, life-altering danger she was currently standing in, she blindly reverted to her favorite, most reliable coping mechanism. She deflected the attention by launching another vicious attack at me. She forced a harsh, incredibly brittle laugh, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the manager as if he were a nuisance insect. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Julian, just figure it out with the accounting department on Monday. Do not ruin this beautiful birthday evening with trivial administrative nonsense," Vanessa snapped, her voice pitching slightly too high. She then turned her panicked, aggressive energy entirely onto me, her eyes manic. "Do you see this? Riley, this is what managing actual high-level business looks like in the real world. High stakes, massive contracts, and minor administrative hurdles to jump over. These are complex things you would probably understand if you were not sitting there absolutely terrified of paying a simple dinner bill." Now, be a good girl. Stop pouting. And ask the waiter for the check. It is time you finally paid your dues. She spat the final words with pure venom, desperately trying to reassert her crumbling dominance over the room. She had absolutely no idea that by dismissing the manager and focusing her petty, misdirected wrath on me, she had just blissfully ignored the very last exit ramp before her entire life plummeted off a cliff. Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, judgmental slits. She was desperate to deflect the terrifying reality the general manager had just introduced, opting instead to double down on her favorite target. She let out a sharp, breathless scoff, shaking her head as if she were dealing with a remarkably slow child. Honestly, Riley, if you cannot even gather enough spare change in your checking account to pay for your own family's dinner, you should at least have the common decency to stop pretending you understand how real corporate operations work. Vanessa sneered, her voice dripping with artificial pity. A lockbox is just a banking formality. It is high-level financial traffic. You sit in your little cubicle all day and you hear these big words, and you think they apply to you. They do not. So please, keep your mouth shut. Let the adults handle the paperwork on Monday. And just hand over your credit card so we can salvage what is left of this evening. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I slowly raised my chin and locked my gaze directly onto hers, stripping away the final layer of polite neutrality I had worn since walking into the room. Please, keep ordering the imported wine. Vanessa, I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the quiet expanse of the room, devoid of any anger, possessing only the absolute, freezing certainty of a finalized verdict. But before you pick up a pen to confidently sign that final check, you really ought to ask Julian exactly who just purchased the entire portfolio of senior secured debt belonging to Oraline House, along with the mortgage deed to my father's lake house. The atmosphere inside the private dining room snapped. It did not simply grow quiet. The air itself seemed to instantly freeze solid. The ambient jazz music piping through the hidden speakers suddenly sounded deafeningly loud in the total vacuum of human sound. Brooke was the first to react, her influencer brain entirely incapable of processing the sheer magnitude of the corporate terminology. She firmly believed this was merely an escalation of our childhood bickering, a pathetic, desperate bluff from her older sister trying to save face in front of rich people. She let out a loud, highly exaggerated laugh, raising her hand to cover her mouth for the camera she was still holding. Oh my God, Riley, that is literally the most embarrassing thing you have ever said in your entire 35 years of life. Brooke giggled, her eyes darting around the table to gather her audience. You bought a mortgage? With what, your unused vacation days? But her laughter died a sudden, brutal death halfway through her throat. Brooke turned her head, fully expecting to see her father joining in on the mockery. Instead, she saw Douglas Jenkins sitting frozen in his heavy velvet chair, his face drained of every single drop of color. He looked as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. His jaw hung slightly slack. He was not looking at me. His terrified, widened eyes were completely locked onto the plain white envelope resting innocently next to his crystal water goblet. The envelope he had mocked less than an hour ago. The envelope Vanessa had pushed across the table like garbage. My father was a man who had spent his entire career in middle management. He understood the brutal, uncompromising nature of secured collateral. He finally realized that the cheap paper was not an insult. It was a loaded weapon resting inches from his hand. Grant's reaction was entirely different. The smug, patronizing banking executive vanished instantly, replaced by a man whose professional survival instincts had just been severely triggered. He understood the exact, terrifying weight of the words, senior secured debt. He knew that if a third party had purchased that debt and immediately triggered a lockbox protocol, the original owner was already financially deceased. Vanessa, Grant barked, his voice sharp, guttural, and stripped of all its previous polished charm. Give me your phone. Right now. Vanessa blinked rapidly. her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure denial. She forced a highly unnatural, wavering smile. "Grant, please, do not indulge her. She is just being incredibly dramatic because she is embarrassed. It is a pathetic act. I am not asking you, Vanessa. Give me the damn phone and open your corporate merchant application," Grant demanded, slamming his hand flat against the mahogany table, making the silver cutlery jump. With trembling fingers, Vanessa reached into her designer clutch. She pulled out her sleek smartphone. She tried to unlock it, but her hands were shaking so violently that the device could not register her biometric facial scan. She had to manually type in her passcode, her fingernails clicking erratically against the glass screen. She opened her primary banking dashboard, the digital heart of her supposedly thriving business empire. She stared at the screen. Her chest heaved with a sudden, shallow gasp. The usual vibrant green numbers displaying her available credit lines and incoming revenue streams were completely gone. In their place was a stark, solid red banner. The bold white text was unmistakable, even from my position at the far end of the table. It read, "Account suspended. Administrative lockbox protocol active. Contact primary lien holder. Immediately." Vanessa's phone slipped from her slick, shaking fingers and clattered loudly against the base of her wine glass. She stared blankly at the dark wood of the table, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish pulled out of the water. The illusion of her success had not just cracked, it had been entirely pulverized. Julian, the general manager, recognized the absolute shift in the room's power dynamic with the highly trained instincts of a veteran hospitality expert. He took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from Vanessa. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket and turned his body entirely toward me. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep, formal respect. "Shall I place a hold on all remaining food and beverage orders until you make a final determination regarding the corporate account authorization?" "Ms. Jenkins," Julian asked quietly, his tone perfectly even. He did not call me Riley. He did not ask my father. He asked me, with that single, highly calculated sentence. The general manager of the most exclusive restaurant in the city publicly confirmed my authority. He acknowledged that the woman sitting in the unbranded charcoal suit was the only person in the room who actually possessed the capital to keep the lights on. Before I could answer Julian, a sharp, invasive electronic ringing pierced the heavy silence. It was not a text message notification. It was a phone call. Grant reached into the breast pocket of his tailored blazer and pulled out his device. He glanced at the caller identification on the screen, and a deep crease formed between his eyebrows. It was a direct call from the senior risk management director at his own commercial banking branch. Grant answered the call, bringing the phone to his ear, his eyes darting nervously toward me. "Dave, I am in the middle of a private family dinner." "What is so incredibly urgent on a Friday night?" Grant asked, attempting to maintain his authoritative posture. He fell completely silent. The voice on the other end of the line spoke rapidly for exactly 10 seconds. I watched Grant's broad shoulders physically collapse inward. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the exact shade of old, dry chalk. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror as he stared directly at me. Finally comprehending the massive, catastrophic blast radius of the bomb I had just detonated, I watched the blood completely abandon Grant's face. He slowly lowered his smartphone, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with the raw, unfiltered terror of a corporate professional who had just realized he was standing at ground zero of a financial nuclear detonation. He did not need to explain the phone call to me. I already knew his senior risk director had just informed him that his own bank was highly exposed to the catastrophic default of Aureline House Holdings. "My job title is not data entry clerk, Grant," I began, my voice perfectly level, slicing through the heavy, frozen silence of the private dining room. "I am a senior partner and the managing director of forensic recovery at Gray Harbor Restructuring Group. we do not process basic checking accounts. We specialize in hostile asset acquisition and the immediate liquidation of severely distressed corporate entities. And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, my firm formally acquired the entire portfolio of your defaulted senior secured debt from your previous commercial lenders. Vanessa. Grant physically shrank back into his heavy leather chair, pulling his arms inward as if trying to minimize his physical presence in the room. He knew the reputation of my firm. Everyone in the high-stakes commercial lending sector did. I turned my head slowly, shifting my gaze away from the banking vice president and locking my eyes directly onto my father. Douglas Jenkins was staring at me with a hollow, uncomprehending expression, his mind violently rejecting the reality I was presenting. But the corporate debt is merely the surface of the infection, I continued, speaking directly to my father now, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum, agonizing precision. Dad, when Vanessa asked you to sign those extensive legal documents last November, she told you it was standard administrative paperwork for a minor commercial lease extension. She lied to you. What you actually signed, in the presence of a notary she hired, was an unconditional, unlimited personal guarantee on a highly toxic revolving credit facility. You did not just co-sign a lease. You fully collateralized her entire fraudulent existence with your own personal net worth. My father's heavy linen napkin slipped from his lap, falling silently onto the thick wool carpet. His hands began to tremble. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, but no sound came out. He looked at Vanessa, his eyes begging her to call me a liar. But Vanessa was staring at the table, her chest heaving, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany wood. I will explain exactly how she did it, so there is absolutely no confusion, I stated, raising my voice just enough to ensure Brooke's phone microphone, which was still inexplicably recording, captured every single word. Vanessa needed massive amounts of cash to fund a lifestyle that her actual wedding business could never genuinely support. So, she began artificially inflating her revenue projections. She would book a standard event for $40,000, but she would submit falsified, heavily doctored invoices to her lenders, claiming the contract was worth $150,000. The banks, seeing this massive projected income on paper, would happily increase her borrowing limits. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, adopting the exact posture I used during aggressive board meetings. But eventually, lenders require proof of expenses. They want to see where the capital is going. So, she created phantom vendors. She set up fake premium decor companies and elite catering LLCs, registering them under the names of her personal acquaintances and offshore registered agents. She would wire massive sums of borrowed money to these fake companies. Once the money hit those external accounts, it was quietly funneled right back into her own private spending funds. The color was slowly returning to my father's face, but it was not the flush of health. It was the dark, mottled red of a proud man experiencing a profound, soul-crushing realization. Those supposed corporate expansion projects you were so proud of. Dad, I asked quietly, offering him no mercy. The money you thought was opening a new branch in Michigan that paid for her diamond pendant. The capital you believed was securing a warehouse in Ohio that financed the month-long vacation in Tuscany. You were not advising a brilliant entrepreneur. You were the primary shield for a systematic embezzler. That is an absolute lie, Vanessa suddenly shrieked, her voice cracking violently. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the table, half rising from her velvet chair. Her carefully maintained mask of high society elegance had completely shattered, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. It is called aggressive cash flow optimization. Every major corporation leverages commercial debt to build brand equity. You are deliberately twisting standard, high-level accounting practices into something sinister because you are a bitter, jealous woman who has never built anything beautiful in her entire life. I did not flinch at her outburst. I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I did not open it. I simply held it between my fingers. Optimization. I repeated the word with surgical coldness. Let us look at the exact timeline. On the 12th of October, you withdrew $200,000 from the corporate operating account, submitting a requisition form that claimed the funds were for securing an exclusive catering master contract. Less than 48 hours later, that exact same dollar amount miraculously materialized in a private escrow account used to purchase your customized imported sports car. That is not accounting. Vanessa. That is documented federal wire fraud. Vanessa's mouth snapped shut. She collapsed back into her chair, her eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for any possible exit, any possible ally. But Grant was staring at his phone, sweating profusely, and Brooke had finally lowered her camera, looking genuinely terrified for the first time in her adult life. Because of your massive, undeniable covenant violations and the documented financial irregularities I just outlined, my firm legally enacted a total cash control protocol this afternoon, I explained, delivering the final, fatal blow. That lockbox review Julian mentioned is not a temporary administrative hold. It is a financial guillotine. It means Gray Harbor now legally owns your bank accounts. Every single dollar that any client pays to Oraline House from this exact moment forward goes directly into a secure holding account controlled entirely by my restructuring team. You no longer have the authority to sign a corporate check, pay your staff, or buy a single imported orchid. You do not even have the legal authorization to buy a cup of coffee using company funds. The absolute finality of my words finally penetrated Vanessa's thick layer of denial. She realized, with crushing clarity, that her empire was gone. Her access to capital was severed. She was financially paralyzed. Then, her manic, desperate eyes locked onto the plain white envelope resting on the table near my father's water goblet. In her panicked state, her brain misfired. She remembered me mentioning a debt restructuring agreement earlier. She assumed the envelope contained the corporate lifeline. She thought it was the release forms for the lockbox. With a sudden, violent lunge, she threw her upper body across the polished mahogany table, her manicured fingers stretching desperately to grab the cheap white paper. She knocked over a crystal wine glass in the process, sending a dark red stain bleeding rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Before her fingers could even brush the edge of the envelope, my hand shot out. I planted my palm firmly flat over the paper, pinning it to the table with immovable force. Vanessa stopped, breathing heavily, suspended awkwardly halfway across the table, her hand hovering just inches from mine. I looked up at her, my expression completely void of any familial warmth or sympathy. "Do not touch this," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute whisper that commanded the entire room. This envelope contains the legal framework to isolate and protect the lake house from the massive fallout of your impending bankruptcy. This is the opportunity to save my father. It is absolutely not an opportunity to save you. Grant violently shoved his heavy leather chair back from the table. The sudden, harsh screech of wood scraping against the floorboards shattered whatever fragile silence remained after my confrontation with Vanessa. He stood up, towering over his side of the mahogany table, desperately trying to reinflate his punctured authority. He aggressively adjusted the knot of his silk tie, his chest heaving as he weaponized his banking vocabulary, attempting to transform the dining room into a corporate tribunal where he was the presiding judge. "You are completely out of your mind, Riley," Grant declared, his voice booming with forced, hollow confidence. "What you are describing is a textbook, massive conflict of interest. You are a direct family member maliciously manipulating commercial debt to execute a personal vendetta against your own stepmother. I know exactly how the regulatory boards view this kind of predatory behavior. By Monday morning, I will personally have an army of corporate attorneys file an injunction against your restructuring firm. We will have you investigated for gross ethical violations and market manipulation before you even finish your morning coffee." I remained seated. I did not raise my voice to meet his shouting. I kept my hand firmly planted on the white envelope, anchoring myself to the table and to the absolute truth of the data I had spent weeks verifying. An ethical violation, I repeated, my tone conversational but laced with razor wire. That is an incredibly bold accusation coming from a senior vice president who actively subverted his own institution's risk management protocols. Grant stiffened. The aggressive bluster instantly evaporated from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, calculating wariness. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Let us treat this like a standard compliance audit. Grant, I said, leaning slightly forward, turning the full, unblinking focus of my attention onto him. Can you explain to the table why your commercial branch's automated underwriting software flagged Oraline House Holdings for severe cash flow irregularities 4 separate times between April and October of last year? Grant swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his starched collar. He glanced nervously at my father, then back to me. Automated systems flag accounts all the time. It is standard algorithm sensitivity. It means nothing. It means something when a senior executive manually overrides every single one of those critical alerts. I corrected him smoothly, tightening the invisible noose. But the real issue is not the override itself. The real issue is the documentation. Why? Grant, did you repeatedly use your unencrypted personal email account to instruct your junior loan officers to push those specific approvals through, explicitly bypassing your bank's secure internal servers? The silence that followed was absolute. Grant looked as if I had just driven a physical blade directly through his ribs. In the highly regulated world of commercial banking, intentionally moving communications off the secure grid to approve toxic loans for a family member was not just a fireable offense, it was a severe federal violation. When Gray Harbor executed the hostile debt acquisition, we also acquired the complete, unfiltered digital communications logs from the mandatory due diligence period. I explained, watching the last remaining drops of blood drain from his face. I have the digital copies of every single off-network directive you sent. I have the timestamps. I have the IP addresses. If you send your lawyers after my firm on Monday morning, my compliance officers will hand that entire encrypted file directly to the federal banking regulators by Monday afternoon. You will not just lose your corner office, Grant. You will lose your license to operate in the financial sector for the rest of your natural life. Stop it! Brooke shrieked, slamming both of her palms onto the table so hard the silver cutlery clattered against the porcelain plates. She sprang to her feet, her perfectly styled hair swaying violently. She pointed a trembling finger at me, tears of absolute rage pooling in her eyes. Just stop it, Riley. You are ruining everything. Grant is a vice president. You cannot just walk in here and threaten his entire career because you are jealous of our lives. I slowly turned my gaze from Grant's terrified, paralyzed face to my younger sister. Brooke was standing there, fiercely defending a collapsing house of cards, completely unaware that she was standing right in the middle of the living room. I am not threatening his career, Brooke, I stated calmly. His own digital footprint did that, just like your social media footprint is about to do to yours. Brooke froze. Her hand slowly lowered to her side. The angry flush on her cheeks vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening pale hue. What are you talking about? My brand has absolutely nothing to do with Vanessa's business or Grant's bank. It has everything to do with it, I corrected her gently, almost clinically. Let us talk about your philanthropic influencer brand. Specifically, let us talk about the Hope for Tomorrow gala you hosted last December. You spent weeks on the internet, crying on camera, begging your hundreds of thousands of followers to donate money to build clean water facilities for underprivileged communities. You raised roughly $350,000. It was a massive public relations success. Brooke crossed her arms defensively over her chest, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. And I donated that money. It went into the charitable trust. You cannot touch my charity. Riley. I do not need to touch it. I just track the disbursements, I said, methodically dismantling her final layer of defense. You put the money into the trust. Yes. But then, as the sole director of that charitable board, you authorized the operational expenses for the gala itself. You hired Oraline House Holdings to manage the event, supply the catering, and design the floral arrangements. And Vanessa charged your charity $280,000 in pure management and premium vendor fees. My father let out a low, agonizing groan, burying his face in his hands. He was finally seeing the entire, grotesque architecture of his family's financial ecosystem. 80% of the money your followers donated for clean water went directly into Vanessa's fraudulent corporate accounts to keep her loans from defaulting. I explained, ensuring my voice was loud enough to penetrate Brooke's rising panic. And 3 days after that massive transfer cleared, Vanessa miraculously gifted you that limited edition, imported designer handbag you so proudly unboxed on your channel. You did not run a charity, Brooke. You ran an unregulated money laundering funnel disguised as a gala. You legally defrauded hundreds of thousands of people to subsidize your own luxury lifestyle. Brooke's knees physically gave out. She collapsed heavily back into her velvet chair, staring blankly at the dark red wine stain slowly expanding across the white tablecloth. She was no longer thinking about defending her husband or mocking my plain suit. She was visualizing her massive follower count plunging to zero. She was imagining the devastating breach of contract lawsuits from her corporate sponsors. She was staring directly at the complete annihilation of her public identity. Grant, meanwhile, had stopped looking at me altogether. His eyes were darting toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. The aggressive, patronizing vice president was completely gone. In his place was a terrified man rapidly calculating the mathematics of his own survival. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that every single second he spent arguing in this room exponentially increased his personal legal exposure. He needed to physically distance himself from Oraline House Holdings, from Vanessa, and possibly even from his own wife. Before the invisible shrapnel of my forensic audit tore him to pieces, he was no longer trying to win the argument. He was desperately plotting his immediate physical exit. I looked around the table, taking in the absolute devastation I had wrought simply by reading their own accounting ledgers back to them. I had not raised my voice once. I had not resorted to name-calling. You all thought I came here tonight to cause a scene, I said quietly, the finality of my words settling over them like a thick layer of dust. You thought I brought a cheap envelope to humiliate you, but I did not need to bring a single weapon into this room to destroy your lives. I do not need to ruin anyone tonight. Every single one of you has already done that work entirely by yourselves. Your own signatures, your own wire transfers, and your own endless greed have already written the exact ending to this story. The suffocating quiet that descended upon the private dining room was entirely different from the shocked silence that had occurred earlier. This was not the silence of surprise. It was the heavy, stagnant stillness of a collapsed mine shaft. Grant remained completely frozen in his chair, staring at the polished wood. Brooke was openly weeping, her face buried in her hands, entirely consumed by the rapid, impending death of her digital reputation. At the head of the table, Douglas Jenkins seemed to age 2 decades in the span of 5 minutes. The rigid, aristocratic posture he had so carefully maintained all evening had totally dissolved. His shoulders slumped forward, pulling the fabric of his velvet dinner jacket awkwardly across his back, for the very first time in my entire adult life. My father looked across the table at me not with disdain, but with the raw, naked terror of a man who realized he was staring into an abyss. "Riley," my father whispered. His voice was incredibly frail, stripped of all its usual booming authority. "The lake house. You are telling me the bank is going to take the lake house? That is where your mother grew up. That property has been in this family for 60 years. I did not offer him a warm smile, but I did soften the defensive line of my shoulders. I reached forward and rested my hand on the plain white envelope that had been the subject of so much derision just 1 hour ago. Slowly, deliberately, I slid my fingernail under the unsealed flap and opened it. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, printed on heavy bond paper, neatly clipped together at the top left corner. I rotated the stack and slid it smoothly across the mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of his empty dinner plate. The commercial lenders have already filed the emergency injunction. Dad, I explained, my tone steady, devoid of the aggressive edge I had used with Grant and Vanessa. Because your personal guarantee is legally binding, the lake house is scheduled to be auctioned on the county courthouse steps at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. But that envelope does not contain a foreclosure notice. My father stared at the dense paragraphs of legal text. His hands shook so badly he could barely turn the first page. That is a formalized, fully funded personal restructuring agreement, I told him. It includes a bridge loan backed by my own private equity firm, totaling $2.5 million. That is the exact amount required to immediately buy out the primary lien on your property and sever it from Vanessa's collapsing corporate portfolio. It completely insulates your primary asset from her bankruptcy proceedings. My father looked up at me, his eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. For a brief, agonizing second, the thick wall of resentment that had divided us for decades seemed to crack. I had my legal team draft those documents at 3 o'clock this afternoon, I continued, making sure the timeline was perfectly clear to him. I walked into this restaurant tonight fully intending to give that to you. I knew exactly how Vanessa would treat me. I knew exactly what Brooke and Grant would say. I knew you would allow them to mock my clothes and my career, and I came here to save you anyway. He let out a ragged breath, reaching into his breast pocket to pull out his reading glasses. He fumbled with the frames, finally sliding them onto his face. He looked down at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. There is only one single condition, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, unbreakable frequency. If you turn to the final page, you will see a sworn legal affidavit. To activate the bridge loan, you must sign that document. You must formally testify that Vanessa Cole Jenkins willfully misrepresented the commercial loan agreements when she asked for your signature. You must publicly admit, right here in this room, that she used you as a financial human shield to fund her own vanity. And you must permanently stop punishing me for refusing to participate in this delusion. It was the ultimate test. I was not just offering him money, I was offering him a return to reality. All he had to do was let go of his pride, admit he had been foolish, and accept the lifeline. My father stared at the affidavit. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside his water goblet. He positioned the gold nib directly over the dotted line. He was going to do it. He was actually going to choose survival. Then, Vanessa moved. She had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock. But the sight of my father preparing to sign away her last shred of dignity violently jolted her back to life. She let out a loud, theatrical sob and threw herself out of her chair. Dropping to her knees right beside his legs, she wrapped her manicured hands tightly around his forearm, forcefully pulling the pen away from the paper. Douglas, no, Vanessa wept, tears carving dark tracks through her heavy foundation, ruining her flawless makeup. Please, you cannot do this. You cannot sign that. She is trying to tear us apart. We are a team. We built this life together. It is just a temporary cash flow problem. I swear to you, if you sign that paper, you are telling the whole world that your own wife is a criminal. You will ruin our name. You will destroy our standing in the city. Do not let her do this to your pride. Douglas, do not let your daughter humiliate our family like this. She knew exactly which buttons to press. She bypassed logic and went straight for his deepest, most toxic vulnerability, his absolute obsession with public perception and patriarchal authority. I watched my father's face. I watched the brief, beautiful moment of vulnerability curdle and rot under the heat of Vanessa's manipulation. I saw him look at Grant, who was watching the scene with wide, judgmental eyes. I saw him look at Brooke, who was still recording the disaster in her mind. My father could not bear the thought of admitting failure in front of them, He could not tolerate the idea of stepping down from his self-appointed throne, even if the castle was burning to the ground around him. Douglas slowly lowered the silver pen. He placed it carefully back onto the table. The trembling in his hands completely stopped. His posture stiffened, his shoulders squaring as he rebuilt the familiar, impenetrable wall of arrogance. He looked across the table at me, his eyes turning hard and cold. "You planned every single second of this," my father spat, his voice regaining its harsh, condemning timbre. "You dug up all this confidential banking information and brought this paperwork to my birthday dinner for one specific reason. You did not come here to save me, Riley. You came here to use your money to hold this entire family hostage. You are using your wealth to humiliate us, to force me to grovel at your feet and betray my own wife." The blow landed with devastating precision, not because it was true, but because it confirmed the tragedy I had spent my whole life trying to outrun. Even when I handed him the ultimate salvation, he chose the comfortable lie. He chose his ego over his home, his pride over his daughter. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, aching reservoir of hope I had secretly harbored for my father instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, sterile bedrock. I sat perfectly still for 5 long seconds, letting the silence cement his choice into history. Then, without a word, I reached across the table. I gathered the thick stack of legal documents. I tapped the bottom edges against the mahogany wood to align the pages perfectly, folded them neatly, and slid them back into the cheap white envelope. I did not rip them up. That would have required passion. I simply removed them from his reach. The final door had officially closed. I picked up my smartphone from the table. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure encrypted portal connecting directly to my private equity fund. The $2.5 million I had personally earmarked for his rescue was sitting in a holding pattern, awaiting my final authorization to wire to the county clerk. With rapid, precise keystrokes, I deleted my father's mortgage trust routing number from the destination field. In its place, I typed in the secure routing information for the State Employee Labor Commission. I split the massive sum into 2 distinct digital buckets. One half was directed into an emergency payroll preservation fund to guarantee that every single low-level employee at Oraline House Holdings would receive their final paychecks and severance packages when the company was liquidated on Monday. The other half was routed to a consumer protection escrow, designated exclusively to refund the innocent brides and clients Vanessa had defrauded. I pressed the blue button labeled Authorize. A small green checkmark appeared on my screen. The money was gone. I had officially stopped trying to save a man who insisted on drowning. Douglas watched the faint green glow of my phone screen reflect in my eyes. He did not need to see the specific banking interface to understand the finality of my action. The heavy, suffocating weight of his own hubris finally crashed down upon him, crushing the last remnants of his manufactured authority. The color completely washed out of his face for the second time that evening, leaving his skin a terrifying, ashen gray. He lunged forward, his chest hitting the edge of the mahogany table, his hands desperately reaching out toward the cheap white envelope that I had already tucked safely away. "Riley, wait," my father choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy whisper. The arrogant patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man staring directly at the complete evaporation of his legacy. "Please, you cannot just take it away. I will sign the paper. I will sign whatever you want. Give me the pen. I will tell them everything about her. Just give me the papers back." I looked down at his outstretched, trembling hands. "The transaction is fully authorized and cleared through the secure server," I stated, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "The capital has already been legally dispersed to the State Labor Commission and the Consumer Protection Escrow. There is absolutely no money left to save your house. You had your chance to choose the truth, and you chose your pride. You cannot buy back the parachute after you have already jumped out of the plane." Before Douglas could formulate another desperate plea, The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open for the final time. Julian, the general manager, did not enter alone. He stepped aside, his face pale and completely devoid of his usual hospitality persona. He was followed by three individuals who looked entirely out of place in the lavish, orchid-filled space. Two were broadly built men wearing unassuming, off-the-rack, dark suits. The third was a sharp-featured woman holding a thick, leather-bound legal portfolio. They were not the police. A sudden, dramatic police raid was for television dramas. This was a commercial court receivership unit. In the high-stakes world of corporate restructuring, they were the grim reapers of finance. The woman stepped to the head of the table, entirely ignoring my father and locking her eyes directly onto Vanessa. Vanessa Cole Jenkins, the legal representative stated, her voice projecting with the practiced, flat resonance of a court officer. I am the court-appointed receiver representing Gray Harbor Restructuring Group and the Commercial Bankruptcy Court of this district. We are officially executing a temporary receivership order. Effective immediately, you are stripped of all executive authority regarding Oraline House Holdings and all associated subsidiary entities. Vanessa scrambled backward in her velvet chair, her eyes wide with animalistic panic. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at the woman. You cannot do this. This is a private dinner. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of that brand. You have absolutely no right to walk into this room and threaten me. The representative did not blink. She calmly opened her leather portfolio and extracted a heavily stamped legal document, placing it firmly onto the ruined, wine-stained tablecloth. You no longer own the brand, Mrs. Jenkins. Due to severe, documented covenant violations, the senior debt holders have seized the collateral. Furthermore, because our preliminary audit indicates you systematically commingled corporate loan disbursements with your own personal banking accounts to fund private expenditures, the commercial judge has activated a total asset seizure clause. The representative paused, ensuring the absolute devastation of her next sentence landed perfectly. This means the legal firewall between your business and your personal life no longer exists. All of your personal checking accounts, your private investment portfolios, your vehicles, and any jewelry purchased within the last 36 months are now officially frozen and subject to immediate corporate liquidation. Vanessa let out a horrific, guttural scream. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was the sheer, terrifying sound of a parasite being violently ripped away from its host. She grabbed her diamond pendant, clutching it to her chest as if the receivers were going to physically rip it from her neck right then and there. She spun wildly toward my father, begging him to do something, to call his lawyers, to throw these people out. But Douglas just sat there, staring blankly at the tabletop, paralyzed by the realization that he was chained to a sinking ship with 0 lifeboats. Amidst Vanessa's hysterical screaming, Grant's smartphone vibrated violently against the wood. He snatched it up, pressing it to his ear. I watched his eyes widen in fresh, unadulterated horror. It was his second call of the night. This one was not from his friendly risk manager. It was a direct, recorded line from the internal compliance division of his commercial bank. They were officially placing him on unpaid administrative leave, pending a massive federal investigation into his unauthorized email communications and his explicit approval of fraudulent loans. Grant dropped the phone. He did not say a single word of comfort to his weeping mother-in-law. He did not look at my father. He grabbed Brooke roughly by the upper arm, hauling her out of her chair with enough force to make her stumble. We are leaving. Right now, Grant hissed through gritted teeth, his survival instincts completely overriding his polished, upper-class facade. He needed to get out of the blast radius. He needed to call his own defense attorney. Brooke violently ripped her arm out of his grasp. Her face was streaked with black mascara, her carefully constructed influencer persona completely annihilated. She lunged toward my end of the table, bracing her hands against the wood, weeping openly. "Riley, please," Brooke sobbed, her voice echoing off the high, gilded ceiling. "You cannot let them audit the charity. If my followers find out the money went to Vanessa, they will destroy me. The brand sponsors will sue me for millions. I will lose everything. Please, you are the managing partner. You can hide the gala paperwork. You can protect my name. I looked at my younger sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I am not hiding a single document. Brooke, the forensic tracing is already entirely complete. I made sure every single dollar your followers donated will be tracked down, extracted from Vanessa's liquidated assets, and refunded directly to the original donors. The public will get their money back. But I will do absolutely nothing to save your reputation. You built your entire life on a lie. Tonight, the internet is just finally getting the receipt. Brooke let out a devastated wail, burying her face in her hands as Grant grabbed her again, practically dragging her through the heavy oak doors and out into the corridor. They disappeared into the hallway, fleeing the wreckage they had helped create. The private dining room was suddenly left with a hollow, ringing silence, broken only by Vanessa's hyperventilating sobs as the legal receivers began formally itemizing the luxury goods she had brought to the dinner. Douglas sat at the head of the ruined table. He slowly turned his head, surveying the absolute destruction of his perfect, wealthy family. He watched his golden son-in-law abandon him to save his own career. He watched his favorite, beautiful daughter run away to mourn her social media accounts. He watched his young, trophy wife weep over her frozen bank accounts, entirely ignoring his presence. Finally, his hollow eyes found me. In that silent, devastating moment, the profound truth finally registered in his mind. He realized that the daughter he had mocked, the woman sitting in the plain, unbranded charcoal suit, was the only person who had walked into this rooftop restaurant with the genuine intention of saving him. Everyone else had just been using him to fund their own delusions. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. I picked up the plain white envelope, which was now completely empty, and placed it precisely in the center of my pristine side of the table. I looked down at the man who had spent 35 years making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own family. You told me earlier not to embarrass the family. Dad, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, chilling clarity. I did not embarrass anyone. Tonight, I only did one thing. I stopped saving people who treat me like a backup wallet. I turned my back on the wreckage. I walked out of the private dining room, my footsteps silent against the thick carpet, moving past the court receivers and the weeping woman on the floor. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to scream or throw a tantrum to exact my revenge. I simply laid the unvarnished truth on the table, handed them their own signed contracts, and let their own catastrophic choices act as the judge, jury, and executioner. I walked toward the elevator, stepping into the cool, quiet air of the Chicago night, completely and finally free. Thank you all so much for listening to the very end of this story. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on Riley's incredible revenge. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to Zoe Revenge Stories. Leave a like on this video and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and be heard by even more people.